Good afternoon. I would like to thank you for having waited for me. I know you have been here for a couple of hours. We worked for the whole night, and we continue non-stop, especially the negotiating groups. And so the room where we're working in was without air conditioning, so I share with you that we're all tired. So I would like to give you some information, and then I will answer to your questions. So, first of all, this G20 is the first one that is being held in the post-COVID period. It is restarting a dialogue that was stopped and which complicated a lot the life of the international community. It's the first time that the G20 puts together the climate, energy, the environment, and poverty. This is not to be taken for granted because these sectors were considered to be separate, and we try to find the correlations. Now we have the environment, tomorrow we're going to have climate and energy, and poverty is a common thread across all these domains. Now, so there were 20 ministers, 6 ministers from guest countries such as the Netherlands, Singapore, and many international organizations, UNESCO, the FAO, representatives of Youth for Climate. And there is a convention of young people who are going to meet in Milan at the end of September in order to make a simulation on the part of the future generation how an advanced society may work with sustainability as a basis. So the communique that came out of this program, of this agenda, is very ambitious, and it reflects the approach that the Italian president wanted to adopt. 7 pages, 25 articles, and then it's going to be circulated to all of you. And I have to say that the most important thing is that it is not by chance. So it is not only the fact of 2 nights spent negotiating, but it is the result of some work that started in February. So there were 17 international organizations in the form of workshops, thematic meetings, in which the negotiating groups talked a lot. And first, they identified the most important areas, and then they were actually discussed until today, in which we obtained this result. This was a methodological approach that has been developed since February, which was very intense and very precise, with a lot of vision. And this is the vision that we put in our resiliency and recovery plan. Now, you will find the main 10 guidelines that this reflects the vision that Italy has put into the national resilience and recovery plan, and so which are also recognized and shared by other European countries, but also by countries that were traditionally more complex to be involved. So the difficulty of these international negotiations is due to the fact that the targets are shared. For example, the societies, economies, and countries have very different histories, very different backgrounds, and they start from different positions. So we can all agree on the decarbonization target by a certain date, but how to get there is not always the same for countries that have an enemy based on oil or the economy based on fishing. So these negotiations are very complex. And I have to say that I understood really how the experts were prepared and how negotiators from the ministry, but also from the different entities were really skilled and talented, but also the negotiating entities from other countries. This was a real marathon, and we had really to run also fast. So the communique was shared and was agreed upon 20 minutes before the end of the last session, showing that there is always something to be done. We always have to align our positions. And as I said, 7 pages, 25 articles, about 10 thematic areas. And this is the most exhaustive communicate in terms of the environmental guidelines in the future that has ever been conceived. When we reach such a target, we establish some guidelines that have been agreed upon by the 20 countries representing 80% of the world GDP, producing 85% of carbon dioxide. So the most polluting countries. And the fact that they're all committed to these guidelines shows that their future choices in terms of policy making will have to be aligned with these targets. So this document is quite binding. So what are the main areas of this document? There are many new areas. We wanted to include them. And all the colleagues agreed upon them. So we start with one of the main areas, in English, nature-based solutions, and also ecosystem-based approaches. So it means that we have to develop nature-based solutions in order to combat climate change in general. So this is a very important trend from the point of view of the organization of the economies of the different countries, but also from the technical point of view. And so there is a lot to do. When you see the communiqué, you will be able to understand it and compare with the text. And then another important area is to deal with land degradation. This is important because this is the first time, especially for European countries, but for all the post-COVID relaunch plans, is the fact that to have these guidelines that have to be reintegrated and integrated into the recovery plans. For example, all the measures trying to reclaim land, for example, reclaiming the land and the reuse of agricultural land. And so you will find all these areas in our resilience and recovery plan, starting from land degradation to the stabilization of soil. This is going to have a major impact on climate change and decarbonization. And then thirdly, this was really supported by the Presidency. Food security, nutrition and poverty. As you know, there is a major problem of unequal access to food. So we are part of the small part of the world that can afford, should not afford, but can afford waste. Actually 30% of food, and this produces a very high amount of CO2, which is so a double kind of damage. So a lot of food waste and a lot of gas emissions. But in other areas of the world, our populations who don't have more than 1,500 kilocalories per day. So there is also a problem of poor distribution of food. And now this theme is included in the communiqué of the G20. This is going to be an area, and all countries have to invest and adopt adequate policies. And the fourth area is the so-called call for action. So in order for the sustainable use of water, so there is much to say about water. And even in Italy, that is supposed to be developed countries with the National Recovery Plan, we had to allocate a lot of resources to create new reservoirs to catch rain runoffs, and especially to repair aqueducts that are leaking water. We cannot afford that anymore, and it's evident that water is a question of spillage and leakage, but especially in Central Africa with low development. The United Nations have estimated that for over 1 billion people, the access to safe water, to drinking water is hampered, and there are areas in which you have to walk for 30 minutes to fetch water, and the water you fetch is not completely safe to drink. So this is a huge problem, And so what we're going to say at the end, which is throughout the communique, the advanced countries have to make an effort to help the emerging and the developing countries more, not only through financial resources, but also by sharing technologies that may actually save lives, because they can mitigate problems that do not exist, for example, such as the potabilization of water. And then the fourth line is by Mario Ciani, another call for action. This is very important. It is fishing. It's about fishing, biodiversity. Over 30% of the population has a diet mainly based on animal protein coming from fishing, so there is overfishing. There are areas in which there is overfishing. There is an important environmental impact of aquaculture, so we really have to regulate this sector. We need international agreements. Each country should not act by itself. So all organizations and nations that would like to intervene on these important activities related to sea and oceans, biodiversity and fishing, they will have to do so within the framework of an agreement. So they have to reach agreements with their neighboring countries. Otherwise, we have over-fragmentation. And then there is a special action on marine plastic litter. So I think you've heard a lot about this. So we got very impressive data on this, because we expect that by 2050, the mass of plastic is going to exceed the mass of living fish in the oceans, which is very worrisome. If you think that the average biodegradation plastic is some centuries, the truth is that no human being has ever survived a piece of plastic. Most plastic is exported to countries where it's actually dumped into the rivers, and then the rivers bring the plastic into the sea. It's easier to understand that we need an international action which has to be very strong. Another call for action, which has been supported by the Italian presidency, is the sustainable and circular use of resources. So for the first time, the concept of resources is circularity. So you have to bear in mind that countries underwriting this agreement can actually see the commitment to these measures that sometimes seem to be unreachable because they have overpopulation or not adequate production systems. So we have to work with the wording. So we have to word our agreements showing the way, but without being a real constraint. But the fundamental thing is that in the G20, we have unanimously recognized that circularity of resources is one of the guidelines that will have to be fulfilled. So all countries have to pass laws in order to develop the circular economy with their new bills and new reforms. And so there is an eighth guideline related to sustainable cities, so circular cities. So we are clearly talking about waste, energy efficiency, and here again, if you think about it, Italy has launched a plan that inspired this agreement. The energy efficiency of buildings is one of the four pillars of our plan. I don't want to give you too many figures because the figures are changing. So some figures may not be exact, but mobility produces 1/4 of greenhouse gases. Residential heating of buildings produces another 1/4. 30% is produced by the manufacturing industry, and the rest is produced by a mix of activities. So when you read these agreements in detail, you actually touch upon these sectors, and so all countries have to intervene on them with international agreements and with a common view. There is a ninth guideline related to education, culture, and upskilling and training. And you understand that we managed our future not very well as an adult generation. In fact, we are actually handing over the world to the future generations in a degraded way. All the people in the G20 know that we have to be quick in changing our approaches. We have to hand over this life to future generations, and they need to be skilled and to be highly educated, more with respect to our current development model. Today, among the different bilateral meetings, I had a meeting with the representative of the United States, and they said that we are actually trying to see how we can invest on education and on universities, because the most important key factor is to understand it's okay to march against some measures, but the young generation should have the right instruments to make an evaluation. And we didn't have these skills, so this is probably one of the errors we made as an adult generation. Then the 10th line is the financial sustainability and investments. This is really very important because we have to make a joint effort at the international level to attract also private investments from banks, foundations, institutional investors, funds. But these investments have to be made on environmentally friendly models. So we pass from environmentally unfriendly investments to environmentally friendly investments. This is called sustainable finance, and it has to strengthen and accelerate our measures to fight against soil degradation or preserving biodiversity, which is a very important pillar. This is the agreement. The good thing is that the international community has acknowledged with great sincerity and with great honesty that there is an agenda. It has accepted the method we wanted to develop, and in the end, this result is satisfactory. Nothing is easy, as I said. In fact, we negotiated until 10 minutes before the end of the last session, also throughout the night. I don't want to repeat the adverbs or the adjectives, but the main driver of this operation is a group of experts from the ministries, from the entities from the different countries that have worked for months, and the last few nights they really had to work very hard in order to make this agreement acceptable to all of them. This is a unique agreement. It's the first time that these categories and these domains are becoming binding for all G20 countries. At the same time, they are recognized by the 20 countries accounting for 80% of the global GDP and more than 80% of greenhouse gases. So this is an important commitment undertaken by all. I hope this is clear. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Do you have questions? Of course, everything will be summarized, and you will be receiving a summary with all details. Some definitions are quite weird when they are translated into Italian. Perhaps you recognize the English title better than the Italian translation. If something is not clear, we're here to discuss. Alessandra Nardi from RD Deutschland. RD, the first German state channel. In order to reach a commitment for sea protection, well, we didn't get it from the communique. Do you think that the G20 is too slow, considering the speed at which the climate is changing? No. This is a very interesting topic. So far, we have been giving some deadline for decarbonization in line with the Paris Agreement. Commitments on sea and oceans have no deadline, no schedule, no precise roadmap so far. But of course, local actions have to be taken. As you can clearly understand, the Japanese policy for oceans might be different from the one in Germany. And I think that countries will have great autonomy and independence, and things have to be fine-tuned. We had the G7, and now the G20 took place, and tomorrow we will have another meeting, and we hope that we will draw a conclusion on climate and energy. Then we will have another G20 and COP26. What was important was to create the link between the initial G7 and COP26. This document is there and puts together all the important words. Okay, Stefano Secondino from ANSA. Minister, one of the topics you discuss very often is helping other countries, the poorest country, to implement decarbonization. You said that one of the main topics is food security, nutrition, and fight against poverty. Would you like to explain how the effort for decarbonization is going to take place, how you're going to protect nature and at the same time fight against poverty? Yes. First of all, the direct fight against poverty is based on sustainable finance with dedicated funds, and also the first time we have pointed out some measures for more vulnerable countries. This is just one sentence in the communique, but it will be discussed at COP26. So there's this leitmotif. So these are fundamental items that will be further discussed. Land reintegration, restoration, etc. This is indirectly, but not really too indirectly, contributing to resources allocation. You have to consider that one of the main problems in underdeveloped agriculture is that land depletion occurs because of not advanced farming practices. And this is something that can be initially solved with more advanced technologies. Sorry, I have a hoarse voice. So I'm well, I get all vaccines, I have antibodies, I'm just a hoarse voice. Sorry. So I was also tested, I have the green pass, I'm fine. So the fact that we want to further improve land use or recover good sea health and repopulate our seas, this is something that has to be implemented via international agreements, and this is going to improve food security and food production. The same goes for water. These are not measures that will change people's life in 6 months, but these are essential, indispensable measures. No, I'm fine, thank you. Thank you so much. Alberto Magnani, Sole 24 Ore. Good afternoon, Minister. I have two questions, actually. First question is more general. So costs were discussed, environmental transition, and the impact for economy and for citizens. What are the measures to mitigate this impact? On Monday, you spoke with Bloomberg about mitigating measures. Second questions about what we just discussed. I would like to understand how these measures will directly involve the African Union and African continent, because we know that these measures will directly impact the African continent. I will answer immediately the second one, which is faster. Amongst the six guest countries, we have the Minister of Rwanda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, that represents the Union African countries, and United Nations, FAO. So the meeting took into account most vulnerable countries. You have to remember that this G20 is just an intermediate phase. It's critical for agreements and is essential in order to link G7 with COP26, which is a natural platform for the discussion of most vulnerable countries. So the agenda is following the schedule that was established. Yesterday, I spoke with Alam Sharma, who is the president of COP26, because all these steps were in sync, discussed in sync with them. And I think that this is a direct answer to your questions. Then there is a problem of resources. Apart from G20, we discussed it at the G20 in the bilateral with John Kevin, but also with Alok Sharma, president of the COP26. And step number one is that as rich countries or better off countries, we have to maintain an international agreement that envisage a payment of 100 billion to most vulnerable countries. Now I think we have gone down to 60. Of course, there are many problems, economic crisis, COVID-19, but as countries that can afford, we have to increase our contribution. This is the starting point. But of course, these 100 billions are not going to pay for everything, but the agreements that have been taken in this G20 and then will be taken at COP26 level will perhaps make the difference. As to the first question you asked, this is more about Europe, I think, because it's clear that we are still far away from ecological transition as we mean it. That is to say, high manufacturing intensity. This is not the case for Africa. Here they speak about fishing, water, and land use. Now, if we refer to European model, Europe is taking the lead at world level. We have a tradition in terms of circular economy, etc. United States, luckily enough, have joined us in fighting against CO2 emission and in decarbonization process. And we have now, however, to consider the following. Let's consider the case of Europe. Europe is financing with Next Generation EU, Green Deal. So it's about 1 trillion, no longer billion, but 1,000 billions. But we produce 9% of CO2 emissions. So even if we are good and comply with all the agreements, all 27 member countries, by 2030, 2050, we can be carbon free. So half by 2030, 2050, carbon free. But this is not enough. It's a very good commitment, good leadership, but it's not enough. If other large industrialist countries do not join in, this 9% can be negatively compensated very shortly. And that's why we have to find the right balance. we have the clear commitment to decarbonize. We should not question it. It's a must, it's a prerequisite. But at the same time, we have to do it internationally with a favorable geopolitical approach, because if others do not join in, you know why G20 is important? Because we discussed and agreed upon all the themes discussed, also with those who do not welcome the deadline of 2030 and 2050. Tomorrow we will work even harder because we are going to speak about energy and climate, but we have to do it jointly, because if large countries do not join in, things won't work properly. And those who have reached the target from an industrial viewpoint are not doing it from an environmental viewpoint, because others are continuing to pollute. And we made the big effort to change the industrial system. So we have to process in parallel. And why things are so complex? We do not have the solution now, but we have 3 levels of complexity. In Europe, we are making big sacrifices in order to be the leader and decarbonize. But at a next level of commitment, we have to compensate for the huge inequalities that exist at planet level, that is to say, those who do not have access to water and food. And we have an industrial system that has to be protected, because if I have a green product and it costs a huge amount of money because it's green and others are producing it at 1/5 of the price, how can I convince the consumer to use my green product that costs much more than another product? And therefore we have the discussion of the cost of carbon dioxide, possible border adjustment, if any, and this has not yet found one single solution to the problem. Therefore, we need market pluralism, because the market has to follow what we do, and we have to carry out this deep transformation process and preserve jobs. We cannot do things just in 1 year or too rapidly, and if this is not sustainable. And at the same time, we have to be committed to reduce inequalities. Actually, I have no global answer. At national level, I can say that we have to take mitigating measures, detaxation, other structural measures to reduce the impact of transition on energy bills. Because if carbon dioxide continues to increase in terms of price, and of course I have to pay for it, but then I find it in the energy bills, and people can be against energy transition because of the high cost. The faster we proceed, the better. When we have a huge amount of green energy with very low CO2 production, at that point we will have fewer problems in terms of TS quotas, but we have to attain it. We have good manufacturing process, we have 60 million inhabitants, rich in industrial production, so we have to find the right timing. Those who say that they have found the solution either oversimplifies or too smart, but we have to analyze it day in, day out, and check out all the possible progresses made, or if we get stuck, and speed up if possible. Stefania Marinetti, ADN Kronos. Good afternoon, Minister. Just to continue to speak about sustainable finance, fossil subsidies were discussed for the first time at Pittsburgh. Do you think that at the end of this ministerial meeting you will mention the topic? Thank you. Yes, I understand your question is very important. To be totally frank and honest, the working groups are working on this, because this is one of the topics that we will touch upon in tomorrow's meeting when we speak of environment and energy. Energy, of course, has a lion's share in the discussion. I don't want to anticipate anything because we haven't reached an agreement, and so I don't want to risk saying anything. But Of course, there are those who say we have to completely remove, or others who say, no, we have to discourage investments in pure fossil activities or reduce CO2 emissions. There are those who do not want to discuss it because they are totally based on these products. So once again, globally, I think that tonight or tomorrow morning, we can work hard and we can really find the right terms, adjectives, and the right balance. But it's important that we discuss it. At European level, we have a directive. We know that we have to work on lowering and reducing as much as possible subsidies for these products, but we have to study it in order to be feasible, sustainable, and honestly, frankly speaking, you have seen what happens with in France. We want to have a sustainable situation, and therefore we are working on this. But tomorrow we will have further information, something to tell you. Antonia Di Costanzo, Repubblica.
Well, so I do not represent anybody. I don't have any party behind me. I'm naked. I can explain what I think and what I wrote. I have no problem. But, okay, if you want to speak, there are two people who should speak. I'm actually available. I read everything about this issue, also a little of theatrical statements. That's okay. A lot of drama around. Talking about these things is absolutely fundamental. So I really believe that all the government is absolutely ready to talk about everything. I don't know why people are protesting against the G20. So 20 nations of the world have actually committed to finding a new direction. So I do not understand certain things. I can only put my face on it and the expertise I have. Daniele Ragagliano from Agenzia Nuova. Good evening, Mr. Minister. I would like to ask a question about the meeting with the Special Envoy Kerry. So, what is your willingness to involve countries that are more reluctant to renewable energy sources and to reaching climate objectives? And which are these countries that are behind in this approach? That's very interesting. So we're actually anticipating some controversial points of tomorrow. Please be patient and try and understand that I can make general comments, but then we have to let the working groups work tonight and tomorrow for the conclusions. One of the irrenounceable points coming out of this survey of the situation and from what John Kerry was saying is that we should be all convinced about the fact that we have to keep the heating of the planet below 1.5 degrees by 2050, not 2.5 or 2 degrees. Even 2 degrees is enormous for climate change. Now, this is a first point in which not all countries are really comfortable. So this is some point of discussion. And then there is a second point, which is a little bit more complex. Since we have 30 years before 2050 to measure decarbonization and the increase in temperature by 1.50, so in the second half of the century, what counts is really the derivative, so how quick we are in accelerating decarbonization. So the simulations discussed by the Americans, but also by other experts, is that if we progressively reduce CO2 emissions, we are going to reach 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees of global warming. I said if we make an enormous decarbonization effort by renewing renewable energy sources, by 2050, probably we will be below 1.5 degrees. What counts is the first 10 years. So understand that in document which we have to reconcile economies only based on fossil fuels, others say that we are reversing the trend of in 2060, not in 2050. So there are very strong countries that have different roadmaps. Well, saying so we should be united on 1.5 degrees. Everything has to be done in this decade, because if it takes more, we are not going to be below 2 degrees. So these 2 points are pieces of a large puzzle that has to be negotiated. So the countries that have problems in these target definitions are the Arab Emirates, partly China, partly Russia, some emerging countries, but I cannot rule out that by discussing these elements we can find an agreement. This is what we're trying to do now, okay? So please remember below 1.5 and all in 10 years. So this is something that makes anyone sure that they will be able to reach the Paris Accord targets. If it takes longer, this is going to be, more critical. Simone Bagnacani. Good evening, Mr. Minister. Well, the first meeting you had this morning was with the United States, with Kerry. It seems that there was an agreement on these themes, and somebody's talking about an alliance. How is it possible to articulate this agreement, for example, in terms of renewable energy sources? What kind of spin-offs for the Italian economy? Well, today, as Italy, we had many agreements. So even on renewable energy sources, for example, the United States wants to accelerate the installation of renewable energy plants, wind power, offshore, onshore, and photovoltaic panels, geothermal energy. So we all agree that this is the effort we have to make. So, and they do agree. So we talked about the semiconductor industries and these are supply chains that have to be strengthened. Well, at the same time, even with the other colleagues I met, there is a shared intention to work in this direction. So, in fact, we also found an agreement on biodiversity, circular economy, and so the concept of smart cities. So I have to say that so people are more aware of what is happening in the world with respect to what people may think. But if you allow me, it is as if we are in a very narrow street and we have, for example, to move around with a huge vehicle. So it's a lot like moped. You really need to move slowly. So we are a big country, but the others are very huge. So and talking to all colleagues, they'll probably say that we have to be very quick, but our inertia is such that even though we want to be fast, it takes time. So we talked about public consultations and how long permits are going to last and the protection of landscape. Yes, landscape. Because these are very relevant and they have to be evaluated when we need massive transformation. The final question from Reuters. Well, good evening, Minister. As it's clear to everybody, one of the problems is how to finance the ecological transition for developing countries, especially. So I would like to know if you are in favor of a proposal made by the Argentinian minister, because, for example, the part of the debt of the emerging countries is forgiven, so that some resources are released to finance their ecological transition. Also, how to finance this process. Are you in favor of increasing taxes on very rich people or countries to help this process now? Well, as wealth redistribution tool, the measure that you mentioned is too small. It's okay. It can provide a contribution. So it's a policy decision. So I have never heard about the proposal by the Argentinian Prime Minister. So the Argentinian minister, sorry. So first of all, we need the financing of vulnerable countries should be more generous, and so we should reach 100 billion, and should also go beyond that. So this whole program of green finance, which is also involving private investors, should actually work in these areas of the planet that are not so attractive, but the real investment for the future is there. So we need a green and sustainable finance, because this can help improve some situations that are not very well now. Thirdly, I am convinced that sometimes it's not only a question of money, but it's related to technological transfer. For many countries, having too expensive technologies can be even a greater asset with respect to money. For example, as to the property rights during the period of recovery or for specific raw materials, I think that major players should waiver these property rights in favor of the more vulnerable countries. So for a certain period of time, they may allow these countries to use resources without paying. So there are many options, but we have to recall that we are on a planet in which 1 billion people has 3,500 calories per day, and all the rest may have less than 1,500 calories. So these are colossal problems. So even the fact of having a more intelligent agriculture, better use of soil, better efficient use of water, water protection, the prevention of disease can help these countries, but we have to do this immediately. We have to be quick. Thank you so much. So this is over. I would like to thank all of you. I actually showed you the summary of the communique, and then I'm going to send you the final text of the communique. Thank you very much.